Welcome to HR Voices. A podcast for independent HR and people professionals and the businesses they support. HR Voices is brought to you by the expert team at HR Independence Limited. We hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the HR Voices podcast. I'm your host, Mary Asante, and with me here today is my co-host, Charlotte Allfrey and Steve Herbert. Welcome, Steve, and hi, Charlotte.
Hello.
Right. Today's episode, we are continuing on our journey of exploring various angles of flexible working. So we have looked at flexible working from recruitment point of view and how that might work for an organization. We've also explored flexible working in terms of 4-day working week and how that has really worked for one organization and some of their clients they work with and how they've gone about implementing it. We also looked at some of the challenges that they may face. Today, we have here Steve, who is an employee benefits consultant, but has been following quite closely flexible working implementation. I'll hand over to Steve for him to introduce himself, and then we can sort of talk and dive into the exciting topic.
Thank you. So, Steve Herbert, I'm Wellbeing and Benefits Director at Intermediary Partners and also risk consultancy as well. And my role is very much to talk around the various issues of employee benefits stroke well-being for employers and employees. And therefore, it fits very nicely alongside this. And I would just say that, the whole idea of flexible work has been gaining momentum throughout the whole of last decade, but of course has been hugely accelerated by the realities of the pandemic.
Thank you for that, Steve. And you're absolutely right. Then flexible working means different things to different people. So I would like to know from your angle, what does flexible working mean? And in terms of some of the commentary you've been given as well.
Okay, well, if we stay away from the subject that we'll get to in a second, I mean, flexible working per se has been changing a lot over the years. So I'm very long in the tooth. I've been in the industry a long time. And when I first started working, if there was any flexibility at all, it was very little and very informal. It was generally an agreement between the line manager and the employee that the employee could start a little earlier and go a little earlier on a Friday or whatever it may have been. And that was pretty much it. No employer expected any different and no employee expected any different. Obviously, things have been moving and the internet coming on stream, email coming on stream meant that people could start to be more flexible and employers could be more flexible. And when I last spoke on this subject to a real live audience, as opposed to a webinar type audience, it was in 2019, it was on flexible work. And at that point, I said, well, there's basically three sorts of flexible working. There's the flexible working when you just pop in whenever you want to pop in and clock out, which has been around really since the 1990s, but isn't that popular with employers for obvious reasons. You don't know who you've got there at what times. You've got working from home, which even in 2019 was an option, but for a small number of people. And that didn't work for vast swathes of the population, which we'll come back to in a second. And then we've got the one you've already referred to, which is the 4-day week, which is a cracking idea. It's the first proper evolution in working practices in the UK for probably more than half a century. But again, it sort of counts out anybody who's in, and I've got a list to my right here, the sectors of construction, healthcare, logistics, retail, manufacturing, or hospitality. Because in all of those jobs, you have to be in front of people, in front of the job. You have to be at the physical location. And the idea of a 4-day week, which is essentially contracting 5 days work into 4 days, that doesn't really work for most of those. The idea of not being physically in place doesn't work for things like manufacturing or for hospitality. So most of the options around flexible working were great for people like you and I that are working from an office, but really rubbish for a large swathe of the population. And then along come Amazon with this idea of term time working,
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting that you've listed all those sectors, because one of the sectors that the 4-day working week has been implemented and has worked quite well is a hospitality organization, but we
Really?
will go
Yeah.
into the details of it. And of course, there's also another aspect of flexible working, which is remote working, because in the pandemic, depending on the nature of the business, some of organizations have also gone fully remote, so that there is that element of it as well, isn't there? Yeah.
Oh yeah, and certainly the companies like our own, we are essentially office-based wallers. That's what we do. Well, that's fine. You can pretty much do that job from anywhere. But if you've got to physically interact with the public on a face-to-face basis, clearly you can't. So that there are downsides to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that probably then comes back to sort of clever rotoring, doesn't it, I suppose, because some of those businesses might be able to implement a 4-day working rota, but they're not going to be, in the true sense of the word, a business that's only open for 4 days a week.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Let's deal with that. You are absolutely on the money. And that's more or less where Amazon have gone as well, with 2 different contracts. But I think the key thing with the 4-day week, and this is either misunderstood or deliberately misunderstood, depending on the employer. It can be either or. But the true ideal of a 4-day working week, as it was initially set out, was literally 5 days pay for 4 days work. You weren't meant to be doing anything extra for the 4 days. And I suspect where a lot of companies will end up, possibly including the retail company you're referring to, is essentially lengthening the employee day in the 4 days to make it all squeezed together, so they haven't lost out on their week's work, which there's nothing wrong with that. It still gives you an extra day off, and that's good for things like childcare, which again we'll come back to in a second. But yes, that's coming back more to rotoring and getting people to work slightly longer shifts, rather than that true ideal of 100% of the pay for 80% of the work.
So today then, if we focus on the Amazon experience, what's your understanding of what Amazon has done and how they have implemented flexible working within their working environment?
Okay. I mean, obviously, Amazon, big beast. I think we need to get it out of the way first. So they've clearly got more resources and more options than most ordinary companies would have, if you like. The way they've gone with this, they've been having as I understand it, a long-running battle with union recognition. They don't particularly want union recognition for their workforce, and presumably the workforce do. And I think the term time contract they come up with is actually a product of that battle. So it's kind of working for the employees already, strangely, in so much as they're trying to find things as a company to say to the employees, look, we're doing this for you already. Why do you need any other union recognition? And the term time contract does pretty much what it says on the tin. So, and I've only worked on what I've seen publicly put out there by Amazon, so I don't have any, insights directly to the company. But essentially, it's saying, okay, childcare in the UK is, to use my technical jargon, sodding expensive, and it really is. I mean, it's off the scale, with allegedly the 3rd highest cost for childcare in the entire world, only trailing New Zealand and Switzerland. And of course, that's a problem, particularly as actually in the UK, we don't, even after the budget, we don't have that much state support for childcare. And is equally a problem because not only do we have a cost of living crisis now, but actually for the last 15 or so years, pay has been falling behind inflation. On a year-by-year basis. It's been fairly gradual, so people didn't notice until that big spike in inflation, but it's starting to hurt now, and people just can't afford the childcare. So what Amazon said is, okay, we recognise childcare is a big cost. We recognise that people can't get into the workplace or can't stay in the workplace as a result of those costs. We're going to say, you can just have a contract that literally says you only have to go to work when your kids are at school. So they're giving you 10 weeks a year when you're not required to be at work. 6 of those are in the summer, 2 at Christmas and 2 at Easter. Now, immediately the cynic in me jumps to the conclusion that's not quite right anyway, because school holidays, I think, account for 13 weeks a year.
Yeah, they do.
So already we have a 3-week balance that's gone astray. But nevertheless, it's a good call. I'm sure many employees, and they have trialed it apparently in one of their sites, but I'm sure many employees would look at that and think, yes, the sheer cost of childcare during those holiday periods, we cannot afford that. This is an answer. So that's what they've gone for. There's lots of question marks about that. But what's your initial reaction to that as an idea as HR people first?
Well, I definitely seem to remember my childcare feeling like a second mortgage. So I would absolutely be up for that. So I think in many scenarios that I talk to my clients about, there are big issues around school holidays, because a lot of their part-time workers can absolutely handle, their hours during the term time. Obviously, there's a little bit of flex because there are, more requests to be in school for assembly and things like that. But that's what you juggle with your general sort of flexible working around, flex your day slightly. But, the 6 weeks in the summer is a real challenge. And actually in the summer, your childcare is much less available, because if you've got a school age child, then it's holiday clubs and things like that, and they don't run all week and they don't run all day, and your children don't want to go. So there's all sorts of issues around those sorts of things, which I just think make 6 weeks a really hard slog. A voice of experience of trying to handle children in the car that don't want to go to football training and cricket training and sports day because they just want to stay home and chill out.
I recognise that myself, yes. Mary, what's your initial view?
I think my view is, yes, term time only contracts are popular generally, and they are popular for a reason. And actually, sometimes not just among people with children, but people with other responsibilities as well. They may well be care responsibilities and other responsibilities that people might have, and value the flexible working that gives them time out of work to be able to carry on or carry out those caring responsibility. But childcare, especially during term time or school holidays, is a massive thing. And yes, you are looking at 10 out of 13 potential weeks that you need to find. You'll be free to sort of look after your own children or carry on those care responsibilities. Is better than the headache of 13 full weeks. So I can see the massive responsibility. And actually, to add an angle to it, from my own experience, I've got a child with autism. And I went through a phase where it was incredibly difficult to find a childminderful or after school activities and those clubs that Charlotte alluded to. Forget that, they were non-existent for my child because I just couldn't find any space for them. So I think if you add in a layer of disability or special needs, then it will be very attractive to parents that need that sort of care. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And yes, you've hit a couple of nails squarely on the head there. I mean, the carers thing, I talk a lot about carers, or have done in the past, which I think is a hidden element of the British workforce. It just doesn't get anywhere near enough coverage. The whole carers who are, doubling as full-time employees, and it's very difficult. And indeed, as you say, children who just can't get, the childcare, be it because they've got special needs, or be it because there isn't just the childcare available. And that, Jeremy Hunt came out with some very good stuff in the budget back in March around childcare, but it doesn't really address the fundamental problem that there aren't enough people in childcare anyway.
Yes, so those are all challenges which makes this whole series of episodes around flexible working very interesting, because there are so many different angles to it. And actually, from an employer's point of view, most employers would want to be accommodating to support their employees so that they can get the best out of them. But from an employee's point of view, they want to be at work with their whole selves without worrying about, oh my goodness, I cannot get childcare, I cannot get this. And I think from HR point of view, the pattern around people taking time off work due to not either being able to find childcare or due to sort of short-term illnesses, etc., of the people they have caring responsibility for. So if there's not room not to work, or planned time off that works for the organization as well as for the individual, then it becomes a win-win for everyone involved, really. So just to reflect on some of the conversations that we've just had, what are the wins from an employer's point of view of implementing flexible working within your workforce?
Well, I think the win is very straightforward, which is in a time of candidate shortages, which we've been in, let's be honest now, for some years. I mean, even before the pandemic, we were in that situation, and there isn't any sign of the cavalry coming down the road anytime soon. So in a time of candidate shortages, you're more appealing to that. About 1 in 5 of the UK adult population is currently not in work and not seeking work. Well, if you can appeal to them, and a lot of those will be people with childcare type issues, then you've obviously got a bigger pool to choose from, and you're more likely to hang on to your employees who, let's be honest, a lot of employees are finding virtually all of their income going straight out the door again in childcare, which it just doesn't make any economic sense, because you're going to work, you're spending all that money going to work and everything else, and then you're losing it. So from an employer's point of view, the wins are quite clear. Yeah, it's better for recruitment, it's better for retaining your employees. Why wouldn't you want to go there? Well, I think there are a few question marks, but I think they're more for the employee, the person on the contract, than anything else. But they're probably wider labour force issues as well. So you quite rightly mentioned, Mary, that this isn't a brand new idea. This has been around for a while, particularly in the education sector, where you have not the teachers, but the staff within schools who are working essentially term time. The question is, and I suspect there's no one answer to all of it, is how does that really work in practice? So the initial reaction I had when I first heard the story, which was stupidly about 4 o'clock in the morning on the day after a bank holiday, but my initial reaction was, okay, that's great. You're going to sort of let people have 6 weeks off in the summer and 2 weeks off in the 2 other peak periods. What happens to their pay? So is their pay based each pay period on what they've actually done that period? Because if it is, in the summer months, they're going to have zip coming in through the door in terms of an income, because they won't have been working at all. So I assume that they're smoothing that pay. I assume that's the plan of Amazon, so that you're looking at the pay over a year and you're giving equal installments across the year. But straight away, that's a challenge that needs to be considered. The second point was around employee benefits. Now, Amazon have been very clear in their press statement and indeed on their post on their own pages that taking a term time contract won't result in the employee having less benefits. It won't affect their group life assurance. But what they didn't say was what those benefits would then be based on. Again, is it based on a notional full-time salary, or is it a salary less than 10 weeks they're not working? And the other big one, which I haven't seen anyone answer, I did tag a couple of employment lawyers in and they didn't go into it, which is interesting, is exactly what happens about holiday. So, people, they're working, whether they're on term time contract or not, they're working. So one assumes they're accruing holiday legally. Does that holiday have to be taken within the 10 weeks that they've already got? Or are they allowed some flexibility with their holiday that they're accruing? And the flip side of that, which I think is really important actually from an employee relations point of view, is, well, what happens to everybody else? If you've got a large number of people on term time contracts, all the other employees might not be able to take leave, going back to Charlotte's point about good rotoring and whatever, but they might not be able to take leave at the times that they would want to take leave, i.e. Christmas, Easter, summer, because they're having to cover all the people that are off on term time contracts. So that becomes a real conundrum in itself. Now, I don't know whether they've been answered, but I've not seen anyone come up with an answer as yet.
No, I mean, that's a really interesting point, because while you were talking about the Amazon model, I was thinking, okay, so how do they cover that during the sort of the 6, let's take the 6 weeks because that's the biggest period, but I'm assuming then they would bring in temporary or contract staff, because they're the type, probably in the types of roles where that's okay to do, because that's the, the type of role that it is. I would imagine, and this is probably a topic just for another day because it's quite a big topic, but I would imagine that they are probably affected in terms of holiday under the Harper and Brazell ruling until that comes back out of the washing machine of consultation with government, where actually they're still entitled to the full 5.6 weeks because there is an anticipation that they will come back after each new term starts. So they are treated for holiday purposes as full-time and are entitled to the full 5.6 weeks leave. And in most cases in education, that's added to the contract and divided by 12 to give them an average monthly wage. But I think I would speak for every HR consultant or expert in the country that would say, I don't want to be the person that somebody leaves partway through the year and they say, can you tell me how much holiday they've accrued and how much they've used?
Absolutely that. You know,
Yeah.
it strikes me as a real can of worms. And incidentally, that's not me being negative about it. I think it's a great idea. I do genuinely think it's a great idea. But I think there's a hell of a lot of questions that you really need to clarify. I mean, another one that sprang to mind, and I put it in one of my articles on it actually, was, well, okay, it's great when you got your term time contract. And incidentally, Amazon have set it up so it can be parent, grandparent, guardian of school age children. So it can be, you know, pretty much anyone connected to the child. So it's great when you got it. But what happens when you definitely want to return to full-time work when the child is no longer school age? Is there a guaranteed right to do so? That in itself opens up another can of worms that, you know, I think there's employment laws will probably be quite enjoying this because there's plenty of potential, I think, for dispute and consultation down the road.
I do think sort of looking at the Amazon model, like you said at the beginning, Steve, they are a huge organization and they can afford to play with different scenarios. And I think that's exactly what they've done in this case. Because in addition to the 10 time working, they've got things such as 80-hour working week. They've got things that are giving people the option to pick and mix what sort of contracts that they implement. And I think without knowing the ins and outs as to whether they've done the term time, prorated, holiday, etc., or whatever entitlement, depending on sort of Herbert Brazil, sort of 5.6 minimum inclusive of bank holiday, etc. I'm sure they've probably worked through it all to see how it would work for them. And being the size of the organization they are, they can probably afford to be more flexible in some cases than some employees can do it. But I do think that it's a real opportunity because regardless of what industry that you operate in, what the pandemic taught us is every industry can be innovative and can be flexible and it can work. So I think my question to you is, how can organizations sort of look at their environment through sort of an innovative lens to work out what might work for them, irrespective of the sector they might be working in? I totally agree that it won't work for every single job. Like you go to your GP can work remotely through technology, etc. But if you're going into a hospital and you need an operation, I'm sure we'd all want the doctor or the consultant or whoever is operating in the room with us, rather than just through sort of their screen, so that there are different scenarios to different things. But for most roles, a degree of flexibility might be possible.
Agreed. Okay, let me just, and it's not answering your question directly, which I will do in a second, which I apologize. But one group that I did mention earlier that actually I should just point out that the term time working won't work for is the hospitality sector. Because by definition, if you're in hospitality, your busiest months are the summer months, the Easter months, and the Christmas weeks. So by definition, it doesn't work for that sector, but it works for most of the others. To come back to your point, so how should HR people attack this? Well, I think the first step, which won't surprise you when I say this, but it's to gauge whether the employer really, genuinely, in their heart, will engage with flexible working. And I think, you know, the one thing that the pandemic did prove, I think without beyond, and it proved it very early, I mean, within the first couple of months, really, beyond all reasonable doubt, is if people had the ability to work at home, they were doing so, and they were doing so well. You know, lots of companies actually improved their productivity rather than went down, which just showed you it can be done and it can be done well. That said, there is a significant percentage of the managerial classes of this country that doesn't want flexible working to work because they're used to the old style, standing over somebody, cracking a whip and making a difference in their mind. Whether they are is a different conversation, but you know, we all know these people exist en masse. So I think if you're an HR person, you're looking at this situation, before you start flogging a dead horse and bashing your head against a brick wall, really gauge whether the management of the company is genuinely engaged enough to want to go this way. And if they're not, well, you can either A, go and try and prove the point, come up with facts and figures, use all the stats that are out there, or you can B, just quietly retreat and say, okay, it is what it is. Let's make the best of what we've got. After that, assuming you've got a management of a company that really does want to engage with it, and it's quite easy to make a business case for this stuff, given that the candidate shortage is ongoing, it becomes quite an easy sell. Then it is just a question of really looking at what's practical within the size company you've got, within the resources you've got. And I would suspect that for a lot of smaller companies, that is a real problem. Again, Amazon, massive, absolutely massive, loads of people, all the resources you could possibly need. You can take a bit of a chance and see what happens. But if you've got 30 people and each one of those people is a specialist in their area, which is what generally happens with, SMEs, that sort of size, then it becomes a bit more of a challenge all round. So I think take it gently, see where you can do it, but first of all, gauge the management's genuine appetite for this or not.
Yeah, the one thing that is certain is flexible working, regardless of your approach, is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And although, yes, Amazon is a giant conglomerate, there are examples of small organizations that have also successfully implemented flexible working. And I come across it within technology companies quite significantly. And talking about specialists, a lot of specialists in their area they are probably in high demand. So it's a strong business case for looking at flexibility and how that might work within your business. Otherwise, they will go somewhere else where the employer is prepared to be flexible for them to accommodate their work-life balance. So that there is a real need, I believe, for organizations to genuinely look at how can we make this work for us and for our employees. And like you said, Steve, if done well, productivity goes up, it doesn't go down, because people appreciate the sacrifice, sort of the balancing between the organizational need and the individual's needs as well to make it work. But I think one of the challenges it presents, especially when it comes to remote/hybrid working, is this whole notion of how do people learn from each other? Because when you're all in the office at the same time, you kind of pick up conversations that people are having about different things. And there's the whole coffee sort of machine routine, or sort of quick 5-minute break outside where people sort of smokers congregate, etc. And to have all those conversations when you pick up, and if you're remote or hybrid or not in at the same time, one of the key concerns about people who are pushing back on flexible working is the ability to learn from colleagues and from each other. What's your take on that?
I think it's valid, isn't it? I mean, it's undoubtedly valid. And I think, and this almost sounds ageist, which is not meant to, but I think the reality is that the younger you are, the more you probably need some of that discipline to go in and to learn from other people before you start taking advantage of the flexibility. Which is not to say they all need that, it's just any grouping is a mixed grouping. But I think, when you're learning your way through a job for the first time, then you probably need a bit more hands-on in the office experience. I mean, it's coming away from the subject, but it is coincidentally in exactly the same space you were just referring to. That I spoke to a company a couple of weeks ago who've got increased amounts of mental health and stress issues. And they've said the problem they think, and they're quite keen on flexible working and everything else, but they said the problem from their point of view is that they're not able to see that, because the people are working at the other end of a screen. Instead of seeing somebody 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, you're seeing them, tops 1 or 2 hours a day, if that, and then through a screen. And people are masking their illnesses and their conditions, so they're not actually really showing. So there's always a case to be made for physical face-to-face interaction. But I think overall, remote working has been proven to work, will be proven to work, and is the direction of travel. And I think managers that are sort of against that will pay the price, because recruitment consultants, and I know quite a few of those, are saying all the time that, if you've got an employee who's looking around, a candidate looking around, and they've got 2 offers, they nearly always take the one with some flexibility. They won't take the one that requires the 5 days in the office.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think just going back on something you said a little bit earlier, based on this Amazon model that you were talking about, when they sort of put the parameters in place for that, this is open to parents, carers and grandparents, I think actually it's quite important, isn't it, to understand then whether that becomes discriminatory, or the impact on those perhaps who aren't parents, carers and grandparents, and that actually they might like to work term time only anyway, because they might want to travel, or they might want to just pursue other interests and things like that.
I did think exactly the same thing on that. Whether they've made that, that's how Amazon worded the press release. That's how Amazon would put it on their website. I suspect, given the fact they are going to have some fairly serious employment law support, I suspect that actually that's more a front of house rather than the reality of the contract. But you may well be right, because otherwise it does immediately sort of raise a red flag, doesn't it, around discrimination. Don't disagree at all. The other contract they put out at the same time, incidentally, which I think Mary's already alluded to, was the 80-hour pick and mix contract, where the employee literally tells them, right, I'm going to do 80 hours a month, that's my contract, but I'm going to do these particular shifts, X, Y, and Z, 2 at night, 2 in the day, whatever it may be. That's what I do, rather than the employer dictating to the employee. And going back to the points that I think all 3 of us have made, that's great if you're Amazon, but I think for most companies, that's probably a really big ask.
Yeah, it wouldn't work.
Well, one of the key things, a couple of things in what you said, one of them is young people needing to be an office environment. I think it's not just young people, it can be people who are new to role. It can be people who work very closely with others within their role to be able to get their job done. But I do think that given most roles, as I said, you can really find a good balance between in person. So you can be in the office with a purpose for some discussion, for some guidance meetings, etc. It doesn't mean you need to be there 5 days a week or that sort of thing to be able to work. And Amazon communication is also very important in whatever you do, regardless of the size of your organization. And a quote from Amazon's website is, we've listened to our employees' views on flexible working, and that they are really proud that they've introduced new and innovative options based on their feedback. So even with their size, they really sort of consulted with their employees, listened to their views, and they've come up with different ways, different options of it working for them. And I think some of the conversations we've had, communication has also come through very strongly, that communicating with your employees, what is working, what's not working. Actually, we've tried this, it doesn't work. Maybe we try something else, or maybe we give up altogether, or we do something in between. Is key to whether it works within your environment or it doesn't work at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I always say back in the employee benefits space, which you sort of touched on in passing, but I know lots of companies from small to large and all points in between who have got really good employee benefits packages, but they don't communicate them well. And essentially it's money down the drain. Well, whatever you're doing with employees, you need to communicate in a variety of mediums and in a way that addresses even the lowest common denominator, so that everyone understands what you're saying and then work forward from there. And I think that is a genuine problem in the UK workplace, that our communications between employers and employees are so often patchy at best and downright awful at worst. So that's something that I agree your point totally. Communicate, bring them along on the ride, make them understand why it's good for them, and then people engage. But if you just impose from the top down without that communication, nothing works.
Great. And you posted a couple of things about this particular introduction of 10-time contracts. Can you tell us some of the comments that you got from people when you posted about it?
A fair amount of cynicism, which I think probably goes with the turf if you're as big as Amazon, to be fair, because, you know, there's going to be some certainly employee relation issues there. And of course, I think they've had strikes recently as well, haven't they? So a degree of cynicism, probably not, again, helped by the whole debate about union recognition or not. Other than that, I think the vast majority of comments were broadly, yeah, this is a good idea. So I think if we sort of take away the haters, because, you know, they're always going to get those out there somewhere, I think most people who would stand back and look at this and say, well, okay, as long as it's done in a fair way. So again, if I go back to that smoothing of pay point, if you got a point where 1 month of the year you get no pay at all, that's a problem. That's clearly a problem. So it's got to be done in a fair and sensible way. But I think most people would accept this is a good move and a step in the right direction. And I think it is. You know, I think it's a start, isn't it?
Yeah, I suspect from pay point of view, actually, they'll probably go down the route of what most people who work within the educational sector,
Exactly.
Which is you work X amount of hours and you are off or expected to take your holidays during a certain time period, but your annual salary may be spread across the entire year to make that work. And there may be some who are purely on part-time basis, which is only work, let's say 39 or 36 hours a week, in which case, so that there are probably ways of looking at that and addressing it so that it won't be a whole month without any pay at all.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some logic to it. As I say, it's just not immediately apparent from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just touch on perhaps taking the economics and the logistics out of flexible working, because I think it's quite interesting when, you know, we're very much into it's the number crunching, it's the hours, it's the pay, it's how it's worked, it's what outputs there are. I always find it quite interesting, you know, when we sort of say, actually, if you look at the financials, if you're going to pay out the equivalent to a small mortgage for childcare, then actually there's probably no point paying that out and you might as well be at home, look after your child. I think there's quite a big space there to sort of really focus in on actually people don't want to be at home and that they want to still develop their careers. I mean, I was always a mum that said, oh, you know, of course I'm going to stay at home and, you know, but I want the best worlds. I want my cake and I want to eat it. I want to develop my career and I don't want to be sat at home as a, you know, a stay-at-home mum. So for us, yes, we pretty much spent what I earned on childcare. But that was for my development and because I wanted to continue my career and I didn't want a very big career break.
I think you're absolutely on the money there, but it's wrong, isn't it, that we're expecting people to basically do that. As a society, you know, this is not a political point, it's just a generic society point. You shouldn't be in a situation where you're having to go to work for essentially zero. And in some cases, people are actually going to work and coming out worse off as a result of childcare just to keep your career going. You know, there has to be a better solution. And I think, you know, Amazon are well on the way to finding some of that, albeit the fact that, you know, I'm assuming that people are sort of a bit worse off in their salary during that period, but probably compensated for by the childcare costs.
Yeah, but I mean, this as a model would have absolutely worked for me at that, you know, when my kids started school, not in the early years, but then in the earlier years when you're paying for nursery fees, the nurseries are open through the holidays and your childcare doesn't stop. I mean, you know, you still have to pay for it, but it doesn't reduce. So you've got more flexibility to keep your childcare going during the holidays. But I think once they get to school and you have then got those gaps in the childcare in the holidays, to have a model like this, which means that actually you can, you know, maintain a role. Whether I don't know, it's interesting, isn't it, to see how that pans out and whether that would impact your career development internally by you having 10 weeks off a year and whether that would hold you back in the business. But, you know, it's the fact, I mean, let's be honest, let's play devil's advocate here. Anyone listening to this that sort of, you know, perhaps doesn't want to have children or hasn't had children would say, well, you chose to have children. And yes, we did. And so, yes, we have to carry the financial cost and burden of that. And I completely understand that. But actually, I didn't want to put my career on hold. And there are many out there that don't. And so this would have been a really good model and a good, you know, middle ground to enable that to continue.
Yes, and I think from the point of view of your members in particular, I think it's a good conversation to be having with the employers they're dealing with, certainly.
Great, thank you very much. Before we bring it to an end, what are your top 3 or 5 tips for employers looking at introducing flexible working within the environment?
Well, I think number 1 remains as it was, which is make sure the employer genuinely wants to go that way first. So that's number 1. Number 2, if they don't, try and persuade them using facts, figures, because there's plenty out there that you can use. If they still know, then there's no point in carrying on down that line. Assuming you're getting a green light on the first 2, going back to your point, I think, Mary, engage with the workforce, find out what the workforce are actually going to welcome, because there is nothing worse than coming up with a policy that strikes you as a great deal, strikes the management as a great deal, and the employees just look at you aghast. Well, why would I want to do that? And we've all been at companies where that's happened. That everything's put forward to you and you think, well, that's no use to me at all. So engage with the workers, make sure that they actually want some flexibility and what may work best for them, and then communicate it well. Whatever you're going to do, communicate it well, communicate it regularly, and make sure you keep doing that in a variety of mediums until everyone's got the message and keeps getting the message.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Steve, once again for your time. And thank you, Charlotte, for being a great co-host. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in and for listening. If you have any questions or any comments at all on this episode, please do get in touch and would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of HR Voices. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover or would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media or email us at hrvoices@hrindependence.co.uk. Tune in next time.